My name is Caitlin McConnell, and I'm here today with Oren Alcorn, a longtime minister in Douglas County, Missouri, who has preached hundreds of funerals. We're visiting today as a part of Buried History, an oral history project documenting Ozarks death and funeral traditions that is produced by Ozarks Alive and Missouri State University Libraries. The date is September 16th, 2024, and we are speaking at Clinkenbeard Funeral Home in Ava. So thank you again for visiting today. This is exciting. Well, so right before the recording started, we started talking about your first funeral. That was something I was going to ask to kind of kick things off, was how did you get into, I don't want to say the funeral industry or the business or whatever the correct term would be in terms of your role as preaching funerals?
Well, it is part of your responsibilities and duties as a pastor to officiate funerals. At least that's how I was trained to think and believe. So my first church that I pastored was the Little Zion Church at Denlow, which is about 20 miles east of Ava. I was 17 when I was called to pastor that church.
Wow.
I was a newlywed. My wife and I had just been married for a couple of months, and so my pastor that I was, the church where I was attending, said, "Oren, there's a little church over in the east end of Douglas County that needs a pastor," and they asked me to make a recommendation, and I recommended you. So I went over and preached for them, and they said, "Yeah, we'd like for you to do that." A man by the name of Barney Netterman was attending church. As a matter of fact, I was there 4 years, and probably about 2 years into it, he and his wife started attending. And about that same time, he got very sick. And he was in the hospital, of course, and knew he was going to die. And he gave instructions. He said, "Now, when I leave this world, you get that young preacher down at the church down at Denlow to do my service, and you tell him I want it short and sweet." And so they called me to do it, and that was with Craig Hurt Hustle Funeral Home out of Mountain Grove at that time. And we had a graveside service at Denlow, and that was my first service.
Wow. Did you have any kind of training in that, or did you just kind of, having been to funerals, kind of put things together as you thought they should be?
Mentors. Tom Johnson was a well-known pastor in this area. I think in Tom's life, and he lived into his 90s, I had his funeral. He officiated about over 1,200 funerals. So he had officiated my great-grandfather's funeral. I had my grandfather's funeral with him. So just in observation, I just saw how Tom did it. And for a few years, that's how I did it. You know, that's the training I had. I had no formal training in that area, just by watching Tom and other ministers officiate funerals.
Wow.
And then eventually I developed my own style. But that's how I started.
Wow. Well, and to back up just a little bit more, I'm assuming you're from Douglas County originally, or how did your family come here, I guess?
My family came here in the 1840s.
Wow.
And I was born in a farmhouse about 6 miles south of here, on Old Highway 5. It's New Highway 5 now. And I've lived here all my life, graduated from Ava High School. And married a young lady that I met in Sunday school and church. And we've been married now 54 years. And so, yeah, I've lived here with the exception of a year and a half all of my life.
Wow. Well, and so if I'm doing the math right, you started preaching when you were 17.
I actually started preaching when I was 15.
Oh, so you kind of knew you might end up going into a church before you even were directed to the one in Denlow.
Yes, it was expected.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you started pastoring at 17, the first funeral at 19. Okay. So, you mentioned kind of the transition from how you did things in the beginning to your own style. What do you mean by that? Like what kind of changed?
Well, the way my mentors and the pastors that were influential in my life conducted the service typically did not include what I would think of as the eulogy. It was more really reading scripture, briefly maybe mentioning the person's life, but mostly it was about how scriptures, what scriptures teach us about life, about death, about salvation, those kind of things. And it was more of a really more, sometimes an evangelistic almost type service. But I decided about 1989, when my father-in-law died, and they asked me to do his service, that I would tell people about his life. So I started incorporating a eulogy, and I've always loved history. So as time went on, I developed it in such a way to where I tried to explain to everyone there what made this person unique. So I would learn about their life, about what they did. I always read the obituary very carefully. Then I would try to relate their time of life to historic events, both locally and nationally and internationally, and just try to help people understand why it was that they were like they were. For example, people who grew up in the Great Depression time, sometimes they would hoard things, and the grandkids would say, why is it that grandma won't throw away aluminum foil? Why does she keep all of that? Because she saw a time when you needed it and you couldn't buy it. Or why is it that the freezer is always full? Because grandpa can remember when it was empty. Why is it that he's so careful about giving us money? Well, because there were a time when he saw people lose everything they had. I've had lots of World War II veterans' funerals, along with a lot of other veterans from other conflicts. And I always wanted to be very careful to find out what was their time of service like, where did they serve? And then I would try to find out something about what was happening then in the conflict. And that's just kind of how I did it. And then within the service, I would try to incorporate, I think I've always incorporated something of the gospel message with it, and make the service flow in that fashion.
When you started, and maybe it's the same as it was in the beginning, but when you were doing the funerals, were most of them in churches? Were there any ever at home in your experience that I couldn't, in date-wise, what year would have you started doing funerals?
1971 was my first one.
Okay.
Yeah. I've never had I was thinking about that. I've had funerals under almost every circumstance you can imagine, but I don't think I've ever had one in a person's residence. And that used to be a custom. Something I think, I've thought about how things have changed, and the most dramatic change, I think, occurred after COVID, during and after COVID. It's been a remarkable thing that's happened. But over the years, when I first started officiating funerals, it seemed to almost be a societal or cultural expectation that someone pass out, that lose consciousness.
Really?
While they're going through the final viewing.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, I pointed to Clarence Clinkenbeard, that I learned, that Connie taught me how to behave myself in funerals, because he was a funeral home director here for years. He always carried just a little vial of smelling sauce.
Wow.
Because you could almost be sure that someone would do that.
Wow.
Even wailing, being very emotional, and crying, and even wailing.
Wow.
Was normal. Now, never. You just hardly ever see that anymore.
Was it a kind of a general, group of people? Was it family members? Was it elderly women? Was it men? Or was it just across the board, somebody would just do that?
I would say typically women. Men were much more stoic. But typically it was one of the ladies would, and seems to me, as my memory goes back, usually one of the older ladies would be so overcome with emotion that they would pass out, and that was just normal.
Well, do you think that I'm not saying they were not upset at all, but do you think, given like what you said about it being kind of an expectation, it was almost like they felt like someone had to do it, so they were going to...
It seemed that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
'Cause that's so interesting. I've read about that, but I didn't realize that it extended even this far into history. Wow.
I certainly remember it. It's
Wow.
been many, many years ago since since I could cite an example, but at one time it was not uncommon at all.
This is an odd question off of that, I guess, but if somebody passed out, like what happened? Like, did someone come and take them off of the...
What typically it would happen during the final viewing. When all of the audience has gone around, all of the friends and family, or all of the friends and just people who had come to be a part of the service that day. After they'd gone around and viewed the loved one, then the family comes up last, and there would be a group there, and typically someone in that group would pass out. And it was just a matter of showing their deep love and emotion and how upset they were. And it seems that our culture has suppressed that kind of emotion in different areas of our life, except sporting events.
That's an interesting observation. That's true.
But we have done that. So now you never see it. People are much more stoic. They're much more reserved in their emotions. People definitely are upset, deeply saddened, heartbroken in some cases, but never to that degree.
You mentioned COVID. What are the changes you've seen since then?
Oh my goodness. Well, to give you some context, for about 20 years of my ministry, I pastored a church here in Ava for 32 years. And during that time, partially I think probably because I was a local guy. I grew up here. I know people, they knew me. I was called to do a funeral service about every other week, all year long, every year.
Wow.
So I would average about 24 a year. And services generally were very predictable in the sense that they would be what we think of as a traditional service. Someone would pass away, the funeral home would be called, they would get the deceased, bring them in, they went through the process of embalming, the family would come in, they would make the arrangements, there was an obituary that had to be worked up. They would decide who was going to be pallbearers. They would decide who the minister would be, how many songs would be sung, and who would sing them. And then there would be a service. And that happened in, oh my goodness, I wouldn't even have a venture a guess if you thought about the percentage of death calls that ended that way. I would say 99%. But in the last 5 years, that's not the way it is anymore. Cremation now is very accepted. When I first started pastoring and serving in this capacity, that was not the case. There was this stigma, and no one did that. It's very rare. Now it is not only accepted, it is normal. Another thing that has become normal that I find to be a bit disturbing is that many times there is not only the death call ends with cremation, but there's no service at all. The person that sometimes they'll have a celebration of life, sometimes they won't, but there's no service at all. And I think that says as much about the religious makeup of our community now compared to how it was as it does anything else.
Well, and that was, this was not part of this project, but a few years ago I did some interviews with a funeral director in Springfield who had mentioned that he had seen a change from even multiple day visitations to maybe there'd be one, maybe it'd be combined with the funeral itself,
Yes.
just kind of a shortening attitude towards let's get this over with.
Exactly right. Here in this funeral home, and this may be unique to this and just a few in this area, typically on the night before the service, there would be a visitation. And actually it was called a flower card reading. And what that meant is that people who donated money to buy flowers, there would be a tag attached to it saying who it was that had donated the flowers. And on the night during the visitation, people was asked to sit down, and the funeral directors would go up front and they would carefully go through and read who gave this flower.
Wow.
And who gave this flower, and so on and so forth, along with also who contributed to charitable organizations or who gave a private donation or whatever. And that was called the flower card reading.
I've never heard of that before.
No.
That's really neat.
That happened here.
Wow.
And it doesn't anymore, but it happened for years.
When would you guess that kind of went away?
10 years ago.
Okay,
I would
so
say.
relatively recently.
Yeah, maybe 15, but I'd say 10 years ago.
You mentioned kind of the term the celebration of life versus a funeral. In your mind, do you see those differently, or is it kind of the same thing?
The way I conduct, if I'm called to conduct a funeral, it is really a combination of both. The funeral itself is the service, and it has to do with the singing and all the rituals that go along with the funeral. But I try to, as I've said, celebrate that person's life, help people see why they were special and unique. And I think for some people, though, a celebration of life, and it's kind of like definition, what do you mean by that? For some people today, the celebration of life is they'll have a barbecue at their home and invite their friends and family to come over, and there'll be some pictures maybe, and they'll sing some songs or have music that was important to the person who passed away, and they'll just sit around and visit and eat and also something connected with funerals when I started, and I think to some degree they still do, is that if the family had some connection to a church, there would be a funeral dinner. The church would provide that, and it would always be free, and it would the people would bring in food, a potluck, and they would provide that dinner for them.
Kind of like you mentioned with what it says about society that we don't have this anymore. I mean, from your perspective, what value is it? Why is it important to have some kind of funeral service or an acknowledgement of someone's life, either for the person who passed away or the people who are going?
Well, if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, it is an important opportunity to, I guess, make a statement about your faith. It is, there again, a part of it. It is a worship service in the sense, along with the eulogy. I think it's important for the family because I think now the term is closure. It is an opportunity to go through that process of saying goodbye, but doing it in a loving, dignified way that also includes expressions of your faith. I think that's why it's important. I think it's important for us to remember as a society that a person's life has meaning and value, and it ought to be something that we think about carefully. The Bible says the day of your death is better than the day of your birth. And the reason Ecclesiastes says that is because it all draws us to this place where we have to acknowledge the fact that we all have an expiration date, and we need to acknowledge that as we live.
That makes sense. I have not gone to that many funerals in my life, but I always appreciate the fact that they happen. And I've been saddened to, hear people talk about, we're going to delay it or we'll do it later or whatever, because I think that there is value and importance of having it. And maybe people they don't understand that until later. Maybe that doesn't hit everybody the same way, but it seems like it's important to mark this moment. Anyway, so
I do. I think it's incredibly important. Yeah.
Well, and kind of going back to what we briefly talked about with the format of how it works. It sounds like, at least in the past, there was kind of a formula. Like,
there is.
And so it's like so even now then when you're planning one, is it where, you kind of have an idea of what songs and things like that would be good, or is that more the family? Like, how do you kind of go through that process?
The family always decides those things.
Okay.
The family picks the songs. And when I sit down with the family, the thing I'm interested in is learning about that person's life, because I have had hundreds of funerals for people I never met. Didn't know the family. Wow. The last funeral I did, I didn't know anyone there as far as the family was concerned, or the deceased. I never saw the person before. I've done that hundreds of times.
Wow.
So I try to learn something about the person, and so my meeting with them is to gather that information, and also just to try to be a comfort to them and learn as much as I can about the person's life, their faith, their what they loved, what they hated, just as much as I possibly can. As far as the service itself, Clinking Beards is very, very professional. I've had funerals with lots of funeral homes. They are incredibly professional. And one of the things they provide you, if you're willing to take advantage of it, is an order of service. This is how typically we do things. And it will begin with a song, and then if I'm involved, and sometimes other ministers are involved with me. That's interesting, by the way. But there'll be a song, and then after the song you have a welcome, and then you read a scripture and you have prayer, and then typically there's another song, if there's 3 songs, and then you read the obituary, and then launch into the eulogy/sermon, and then you end with prayer and song.
Are there a lot of musicians that are kind of in the similar situation where they get called upon to do the music, or does Clinking Beards have a musician that's sort of on staff to help with that?
Again, going back in time, there were quartets. I have also sung at I don't know how many funerals. Wow. That's just the ones I've officiated. I probably have sung in a quartet at 100 funerals. But there were different quartets around and different people, and there still is in our community some people who are very, very good at serving in that capacity and can just do a great job. But now, as times have changed, I see a trend towards just more CDs, stream music, those kind of things. Also, now, instead of having pictures up on a board, you have a collage of a video, where people can reminisce and think back over a person's life.
The musicians change. Do you think that's because people, the family or whoever isn't as familiar with live music in that way, or there are fewer musicians available to do that as there were in the past?
Both. There are fewer, and I think also it's just, I think, just easier for people. They have their favorite songs. They can download 2 or 3 songs that they want. That's it.
And I apologize, I kind of jump all over the place in these because things come to mind and then I go down that trail. But so, kind of on the format as far as how things evolve with the activities between the flower card reading, the visitation, the funeral. So basically, like in my mind, at this, you have the visitation, you have the funeral, you do the family goes through, then everybody goes to the cemetery.
Right.
It, has that changed at all, the part when you go to the cemetery, from your perspective since you started?
It changed. I do not do it the way I was taught to do it. I have a formal. I have a rather formal way of concluding that part of the service. I have it's called a formal committal, and so when it comes to that time, I typically I will read the 23rd Psalms, invite people to read it, say it with me if they would like, and then especially if the person is a believer, I can say it from heart. Inasmuch as it has pleased Almighty God in His wide providence to call from this life the spirit of our brother or sister, we now commit their earthly house back to the earth from which it was taken, and we commend their spirit to God who gave it, not hopelessly, but in the sure and present hope of the resurrection of the dead. For then the earth and sea will give up its dead, and we will be changed to be like unto His glorious body, because He is able to subdue all things to Himself. The one who wrote Revelation was given the instructions right. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, for thus saith the Spirit, though they rest in their labor, yet their works do follow on after them. And then I stop and say, by the way, that last phrase is important, because what it means is all we take from this life is the record of our deeds. And I admonish people, make sure that record is covered by the blood of Christ. That's how we end it.
Wow.
And then with the prayer.
That sounds great.
That's what we do.
How were you trained to do it? What was the difference there?
I wasn't trained.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood what you said. Well, that's
just something I developed.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is kind of a random detail, but people, and I still see it sometimes, but with the funeral procession out to the cemetery, is that kind of the same role in terms of the people who go? Is it smaller now with people going out than it used to be? Or is that just...
Well, in general, since COVID, fewer people go to funerals.
In general?
Just in general. I have seen some rather large gatherings at graveside services. They're a little different than a service here at the chapel. In some ways more difficult. I always ride in the hearse. With Clinky Beards, at least they allow me to do that. So I always ride in a hearse out to the cemetery.
Wow.
And that's what we do.
One thing I don't think we specifically said on this recording, but I'm assuming you're ordained in General Baptist, or is it Baptist? Is there a higher level of Baptist? Like, how do you kind of define yourself, I guess?
I define myself as a well, first and foremost, just as a preacher of the gospel, but I am a ordained General Baptist minister, and I have been since 1969.
Okay. You mentioned when you were a teenager being trained or learning to preach and starting when you were a teenager. How did you feel that call? Did you just always know from a young age you wanted to be a minister?
Not that I wanted to be. It was just, it was something it's hard to explain. It's just something that I kind of always knew. As a matter of fact, as a teenager, I did not want to at all. I rebelled harshly. I did not want this in my life. I'd watched how ministers had lived their life and how much scrutiny they were under, and how it affected their families, and I did not want that in my life. But finally the time came when they call it surrender to the call, and that's what happened to me.
Wow. Going to a church when you're 17 to start preaching there, I'm assuming that, the congregants being older than you in a lot of cases, was that an interesting transition to do that?
I'll tell you a story about that. My wife and I were married in May, and by the way, for the first 15 years of my ministry, I was known as, it's called bivocational ministry. In other words, I worked at secular work and pastored, and then would preach at the church on Sunday and do whatever I needed to do. When we went to Denlow, again, I was 17 and she was 19. And for anyone listening to this, I do as I say, not as I do. But when we went there was a lady in the church. Her name was Hazel Cooley. Her husband's name was Bert. Beautiful people. But she had taught the high school Sunday school class. But this was a rural church with very few people attending, about 15 or 20, all elderly people. And there were no high school kids. So she was really excited when we came because now she had 2 students in her class.
Wow.
Yeah, and by the way, I had her funeral as well,
Wow.
as her husband's. Yeah.
I'm trying to picture where this church is in Denlow because I know I know where the big cemetery is in Denlow.
Right by it.
That's the little church that's there?
Yeah, but that's not the building that was there. That
Okay.
building was destroyed by fire. The one I served in.
Okay.
Arsons burned it down. And this building was built after that.
Okay.
The church that's there now.
Okay, that makes more sense because I was like, I couldn't picture there being another church around there, but that one, that's a beautiful area out there.
Yes, it is.
I guess kind of off of the Baptist and the Christian perspective, you mentioned some people doing funerals for folks who are not believers.
I've done hundreds.
And how does that work in terms of, do you change much about what you do? Is it pretty much the same format in terms of things, the scripture and different things, or is...
Sometimes there's things I can't say.
Because the family doesn't want them included, or do you feel like you shouldn't include them in the same way?
I just don't include them. There's just sometimes there's just things I can't say.
Yeah.
But I do try to say as many. My granddad told me. My granddad had a funny story. He said there was once a man that lived his life, and he was horrible to his family, and he was horrible to everybody in the community, and no one liked him. But there was also a man in the community that could always find something good to say about everyone. And one day it was learned that the old man that was horrible died. So a group of men in the town thought it would be almost funny to approach the man that always had something good to say and find out what he would say about old Joe that had died. So they went down to the square and they said, "Hey, did you hear old Joe died?" And he said, "Yeah, I did. I'm sorry to hear that." He said, "What do you think about him?" And he stood there a minute and he said, "He was a right good whistler." Well, I have found that there is something good to say about everyone. And everyone's life has value, and I don't care who they are. Somewhere, if you look hard enough, you'll find something about them that's virtuous. And that's what I look for.
Wow.
One thing I've done that's interesting, I think, is I have had as many as 3 funerals in 2 days. I've had 5 funerals in a week.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, so many so that I couldn't think about the next one until I got through with this one because I would get names confused. And I've done that several times. I'd have a funeral at 10 o'clock in the morning, one at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Wow. Well, and you mentioned, people, obviously you didn't know, people knew you preached, but how did this, like when you get called for a person that you don't know, is it more that someone in the community is just aware of you and reaches out, or the funeral home calls you and that's, okay.
The funeral home would call me, or someone would let them know that I do this.
Wow. Well, and unfortunately, people listening to this cannot see this box that is sitting next to me, but it's filled with the programs from how many?
About 800 funerals.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did you just consciously keep them from the very beginning, or did you? Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Plus, I also keep a record of them. This is the old book I have that has the first funerals I've done. And I just would put in there John Williams, deacon, when I went to Denlow. I made a little note in there. When they died, what their age was, 98. When the service was, where they were buried, and sometimes if there was another minister involved, who that minister was, because I've had services with 1, 2, 3 other ministers. And that gets really, really interesting because you don't know what they're going to say. If you're the last one, if you're the minister that is supposed to have the service, but you have other ministers, you don't know what they're going to say. So you have to wait until they're through to find out what's appropriate for you finish up with.
So it's kind of improv, not improv really, but just you have to adjust.
I never have notes.
Wow.
I never use notes at a funeral.
Is that at this point, or did you never use notes?
I never use notes.
Wow.
I listen carefully to what the family tells me, and then I start making a profile of a person, and that's what I bring to the service, along with the gospel message.
Well, one question I guess I probably should have asked before, but in terms of the location of the funerals, has it always mainly been here at the funeral home, or is there a good chunk that are out at churches, or and has that changed over time, either direction?
In my experience, a large portion of the funerals have been here at the chapel. But I have done many funerals at churches, and I have done, and recently, especially seems like since COVID, I've done many funerals at the graveside service.
Are there more graveside services now than there used to be?
I think so.
I wonder why that is.
I think people feel, it's hard to say, it may vary from family to family. My impression is that probably it just feels less formal. I think that's it.
You mentioned the wailing and the fainting and things that's gone away. Are there any other traditions or like the flower card reading that were common in the past, even in your childhood, maybe not even in what your funerals are that you've preached, but that doesn't happen the same way anymore?
Yeah. When I was young, my grandfather and even my dad from time to time would be called to dig the grave of a person who passed away. So there would be a group of men that would go out the night before the service and maybe work all night digging the grave. And that was something that the community provided for someone who had passed away as a service to their family. Now you have people with backhoes that do that. That's a tradition that's changed.
That I've been wondering if I would ever come across anyone who still did that just because they felt like they wanted to. And I'd heard someone in the Branson area did, but I've never been able to track them down. So
my grandfather dug lots of graves.
Wow.
Or helped dig lots of graves. I guess the other thing is, and this doesn't happen this much, ministers very often, like I mentioned Tom Johnson, he spent, I don't know how many, if you put all the hours together, how many hours that he spent sitting up with the family as the person was dying. Now we have hospice, and we have services that kind of meet that need. But then it was expected that you set up with the family until the person passed away. That I don't think that happens too much anymore.
You don't get called to do that in the same way.
Yeah. No. Now I have spent all night with families that lost a loved one, especially, and I can think of 2 or 3 occasions where it was very tragic, and I spent all night with them. Yeah.
Wow.
But not like that.
Yeah. It's a delicate question because I know that this is a very sensitive topic in general, but are there any moments or stories or things that you feel stick out that are appropriate to share that have been memorable for you in certain ways?
Not with this funeral home, but I don't know if I should tell this. Not with this funeral home at all. It was a different funeral home that's not here now. But I can remember on one occasion where I was called to do a service, and the gentleman was a veteran, but he did not want a vault. It was with a different funeral home, like I said, that's not here now. And when they called me, they said, "Oren, we want you to do this service. The man is a veteran. His wife is not well, so we want a really short service." And I said, "Okay, well, whatever meets the family's needs." And after the service was over with, they said, "Okay, we're going to go over to the cemetery." It was up here at Ava Cemetery, on the north slope of the cemetery, and it was in February. And they said, So we have a military service, so you really don't have to go if you don't want to. And I said, well, I'll go and walk the casket down to the grave.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the tradition, by the way. And so I did that, and I was standing there by the funeral director and the two veterans that was getting ready to start their part of this service, a special service for veterans. And they had taken the casket, and because there was nothing to let the casket down into the grave, they had set it up on a stand. And just about the time the service started, I saw the stand start to tilt. And the casket fell off and went boom.
Oh my gosh.
And all the funeral director had time to say was, oh no. And after it stopped, they went down and gathered it up and put it back on the stand and made sure that it stayed there until the service was over. Yeah, that was quite and like I said, I've had services for murder-suicide, and they buried both of them side by side, a husband and wife, but he murdered her, then killed himself. I had one it was terribly tragic. A young lady that attended our church was killed in an automobile accident. She was beautiful, well-known in the community, played volleyball, just one of those kids, and I think she was a junior, senior in high school. There was 1,200 people showed up for the service. Just filled the gymnasium, the largest funeral I was ever a part of.
Wow.
And I was responsible for that service, along with a lot of other speakers that they had, but I was the one responsible for it. I've had funerals for veterans that just had incredible stories of valor and heroism. And I had my mom's funeral, my dad's funeral, my grandma's funeral, my grandpa's funeral, my aunt and uncle's funeral, my mother-in-law and father-in-law's funerals. I've had all of those.
Wow. That's, I mean, all of the pieces of history that you weave together and being able to be part of that. I mean, it's a horribly sad moment, but I'm glad that someone who's as appreciative of you as being able to help is there to be part of everything.
I had my, Tom Johnson, I had Tom and Jules' funeral of, in doing all the funerals I've done, my approach is that I need to do this as a servant. And this may sound a little strange, but almost like professionally. So I kind of disciplined myself over the years not to get emotionally involved too much, because I can't. You know, you can't be all broken up in sorrow and try to help a family that's in sorrow as well. So I kind of disciplined myself to make that not happen. And that's been a part of my life. And it has some unpleasant effects sometimes. But that's just part of it. So I have a great relationship with the funeral home here. And we've had, like I said, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of funerals together.
When you say unpleasant effects, what do you mean by that?
After having several funerals in a row, I can control how I feel, and I can control my emotions unless I'm sleeping.
Oh.
Then you don't have any control over it. And sometimes those things come up.
Like nightmares and things like that?
Not so much like nightmares, but more like a stress reaction.
Oh.
Because doing a funeral is a stressful thing.
Yeah.
Even after all these years and after doing them, I mean, this is something you're doing, and you must do it well, in my opinion, or you can hurt people. Suicide, especially young people, and their suicide. When young people commit suicide, we know that's a terrible thing now. You don't want to say the wrong thing about that. You don't want to leave people with the wrong impressions about those kind of things, and you have to be careful in what you say, and that can be a very stressful experience.
How do you how do you decompress from something like that?
I'm a runner.
Okay.
About 15 years ago, I got into the running community. As a matter of fact, Lynn Klein and I are good friends.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and we're in the same running club.
Okay.
But that's one way I've done it over the years is I'm a runner.
Wow.
So I'll run 30 miles a week, and I can go out and think and pray and run and be with people in a completely different circumstance in life, and that's what I do.
Wow. Well, I'm thinking, and I'm looking at my questions. I think those were the main things I was going to ask you, but what haven't I asked that you think is important to mention?
That life is a really beautiful thing. It's a great gift we have from God, and that death is an important part of it. And it shouldn't be minimalized. It's something that I don't know if celebration is the right word, but we should contemplate carefully what that means. Again, as far as I'm concerned, for a believer, it is a great opportunity. I had a pastor one time say that he felt, well, let me give you I'll kind of wind up what I say with this. I had a great friend in the church that I considered to be just a great Christian man. And his name's Mark Stover. Came from Iowa. Kind of a funny person. He engineer, but just a beautiful, beautiful Christian witness. And Mark had colon cancer and thought he could beat it at first, but no. And when he knew he was dying, he decided to give his testimony at church. And it was actually put on a CD. But during his testimony, he said, let me tell you a story. He said, up in Iowa, he said there was a story of this young pastor that got his first church. And when he arrived at the church, he was told that one of the charter members, a lady that was a faithful Christian, was dying. And she was in the hospital. And he said, you need to go see her. And he thought, man, how do you do that? What do you say? You know, because I've done a lot of that in my life. And he said he kind of summoned up the courage, put his Bible under his, put his tie on, went to the hospital to see her. So he said he knocked on the door, and she said, come in. And he opened the door and said, introduced himself. And she said, oh, and from the Swedish background of the people in Iowa, she had that kind of accent. Oh, pastor, she said, I'm so glad to see you. She said, I've been sitting here, I've been laying here praying and thinking, and I'm just so honored. And he said, what do you mean? He thought by him visiting. And she said, no, I'm so honored because I never thought the Lord would trust me to do something this hard. Die. Wow. Die as a believer. Die faithfully.
Wow.
And I thought, people need to think more about that.
It's part of everything.
It is.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to visit. This has been so interesting, and I know everybody's going to like to hear what your experience has been with all of this. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.